the emperor, and then the final resolution of iconoclasm 120 years after it started. It was a very bitter struggle. And then also look briefly at the events in the West of Charlemagne and the creation of the Holy Roman Empire, which is the ultimate oxymoron. It wasn't holy, it wasn't Roman, and it wasn't an empire. So, at least from a Byzantine point of view, it was something else. So, so the end of the 7th century, we were dealing. There was the ecumenical council, which finally dispatched monophysitism. It validated the theology of St. Maximus the Confessor, and his position against monoenergism, monothelitism, with the conciliar dogmatic definition that there were two wills and two energies in Christ, and that the wills and the energies are actually connected with the natures, not simply with the hypostasis. The hypostasis is the subject of the will, but the energy of the nature comes from, is part of its fundamental constitution, and as it was originally created, rooted in the original word, the Logos, which came from the Logos himself. Christ the Logos spoke the word, which is at the heart of every being and every nature. And with that word is an inherent energy, which is like a dynamic potential that has to be actualized. Now, the difference between the created and the uncreated is that in the uncreated, there's no movement. Nothing has to be actualized. Everything is at the fullness of its potential, the fullness of its realization. There's no development, there's no progress, there's no growth. It's all in the present, the absolute present. There's no time, no dimension of time. And so when you're dealing with Christ, you have one single subject, one hypostasis, in other words, in two natures and from two natures. So with two wills and two energies, coming from his humanity and from his divinity, but a single person and a single subject who is he is the subject of both the divine activities and the human activities. On one hand, he heals the sick and raises the dead, and on the other hand, he feels pain and dies. And it's still the Logos incarnate who is doing this. One person, two natures, two wills and activities. And so that really brought, in a sense, that whole movement of the ecumenical councils to a close, because that was the kind of main issue that had actually been going on ultimately since Chalcedon, and even, you could say, even since Ephesus in 431. And it took until 680 to kind of finalize it. Around the year 723, you had an emperor, Leo the Isaurian. Isaurian also is sometimes written as Leo the Syrian. And one of the things that's important to remember is that at this same time, large parts of the Middle East, as well as all of northern Africa, had already been conquered by Islam, and so they were under Islamic domination. But there were people from those parts of of the world, parts of the empire, who were very much involved in the government and in the armies and things like that. And so usually the emperors rose up from, often within the armies. They had, there was a dynastic kind of flow to some degree in the Byzantine Empire, but for the most part the emperors were elected, actually. And very few of them died in their beds, at least of natural causes. Leo the Isaurian, coming from Syria, would have been very, very conversant with not only the tradition of the church in Syria, which was, here again, was Antiochian, but he was from eastern Syria, and so it was very actually probably kind of on the fringes. But there had never been in the Syrian church, in the kind of ethnic Syrian church, the use of icons. It just never developed. It was much more a Greek and Latin thing.
What about the Copts?
Yeah, the Copts.
Sure. They had icons.
And some of the Eastern church, the Aramaic and Syriac-speaking churches, did have icons, but their use was minimal. They weren't like the Byzantine churches where everything was covered with icons. And even before the problems with, even before the iconoclast controversy in the Greek churches, everything was covered with icons in the churches. And even going back, they found this ancient synagogue in Capernaum, and the entire thing was frescoed with icons in Judaism. So it's not like the Jews eschewed the images. They just didn't worship them. Just like Christians don't eschew images, we just don't worship them. We use them, and we'll get to some of that. But there was one of the there was always, especially from the Syriac speaking part of the church, this kind of discomfort with using icons, and especially if you remember some of the aspects of both the Nestorian and the Monophysite controversy, there was a sense that it was shameful to depict Christ in his humiliation, because his having taken flesh was his humiliation. And how can the eternal God be transcribed or be circumscribed and depicted? And so there were all these underlying issues and questions. There was of course the whole Exodus, Ten Commandments thing of no graven images, but for the most part that was not part of the rationale. The real rationale was about depicting Christ in his humiliation. And these are themes that then get developed.
I'm sorry, at that time, besides Christ, who did they paint it in their icons?
Oh, the Mother of God and all the saints, just like we did.
The saints that they had at that time.
The saints they had at that time.
And the Bible
and biblical scenes.
Stories.
Yeah. And some of the most ancient icons that they have are, well, Mary. The most ancient icons are Christ as the great shepherd, often with like a lamb over his shoulders, and Mary, praying in the Orans position. This is like end of the second century. Very, very ancient. Everybody knows the hymn "Pod Tvoyo milost," right? In Russian, right? It's beneath thy compassion. Well, they found that's from the 2nd century. You know, the veneration of the Mother of God is very, very deep in the church, and so you know, so the use of imagery too is, you know, goes all the way back into Old Testament times. Even the temple itself had images of angelic beings within it. So, you know, the kind of basic fundamentalist arguments just were not. They were understood in context. But with the rise of Islam, one of the things that developed within Islam, and it's interesting that there are different attitudes within Islam, and the Sunnis have a different attitude than the Shias towards icons, and the Sunnis, who are the kind of major sect of Islam, are radical iconoclasts. There's no images. Whereas the Shiites, they do have images in their art and in their religious art. I don't think they depict Muhammad, but for the most part, it's a very different attitude than their cousins across the Tigris. But it was basically the Islamic armies as they swept through the Middle East and all of North Africa, that would go through, and among other things, just like ISIS did, would go through and strip the churches and destroy the images. And make the accusation that, well, the Christians were weak because they're idolaters. So this got into the popular culture. There's also an accusation with that because Judaism was also iconoclastic, that there was a kind of a Jewish influence in the attitudes of the iconoclasts. Who knows? But there was certainly this kind of prevailing Semitic discomfort with images from the Syriac, who are Semites, the Syriac part of the church, Syriac-speaking part of the church. Eventually, around the year 741, Constantine V becomes emperor, and he is also from eastern Syria, and Styles, the son of Leo, and so it's part of the Isaurian dynasty, and he also is very acutely aware of this whole issue, and since his father started this iconoclast movement within the church, he redoubled it. And so the troops would go from around to the churches and to the monasteries and to the houses and take the icons and burn them. Go into people's private homes and confiscate the images, and whitewash churches and things like that. Well, obviously that was probably not a very popular thing in many places. And so there's an ethnic element in this between a Greek population and a Syriac population. But part of it was buoyed by this sense of trying to strengthen the Christian population, which they feared was being weakened by this idolatry of the icon, as was creeping in according to the accusations of the Muslims. In 754, Constantine V, whose name was called, who was called by his enemies Capronymus, which means name of dung, because he allegedly defecated in his baptismal water. So he had a rather that lived with him for the rest of his life. He also styled himself as a theologian, and this was quite interesting because he made a couple of dogmatic pronouncements. One, that the only adequate icon of Christ is the Eucharist, and that and no other image of Christ is adequate because it depicts Christ in his humiliation. Now this is very interesting, because in the Eastern Church, while we show great respect for the Eucharist, there's no such thing as Eucharistic adoration, and there never was. However, Constantine's theology leads one to think that the Eucharist was being worshipped, the bread and wine of the Eucharist. So he had all these churches whitewashed, he had all the icons confiscated, and he called a council.
I'm sorry, how do you make the difference between worshipping and not worshipping?
I'll get to that. He called a council in the city of Urea, which is a suburb of Constantinople, to validate his theology. And it condemned the use of icons, it condemned all sorts of various kinds of practices, and it was entirely composed of iconoclast bishops. Now, at the same time, there had been a strong resistance against the iconoclasts and against the imperial policy. And much of that policy much of the resistance was coming from the monks. Now, remember, in Constantinople at this time, it was this huge, thriving imperial capital. It was being besieged once in a while, but it was this massive capital city, wealthy, center of the world, where was I going with that? And within its walls, there were about 1 million people. Of those 1 million people, 100,000 of them were monks and nuns.
How many people live in that space today where ancient Constantinople was?
I have no idea how many live within the walls of the old city.
I don't think it's as much as 1 million anymore.
Within the city, probably not.
Well,
there's a lot of ruins in Istanbul, in the old walls. But there's 10 million people in Istanbul. But
you said 100,000?
There's 100,000 out of 1 million people were monastics. For the most part, the monastics resisted very strongly against the imperial policies, and it depended on the mood of the emperor whether the iconoclastic policies were going to be enforced. However, many monks were imprisoned, exiled, tortured, and some were killed for the sake of the icons. So it pretty much galvanized the monastic party within the Byzantine Empire and within Constantinople in particular. Although this policy was, enacted throughout the empire, its focus was Constantinople, and so the monastic community, broadly defined, did everything they could to undermine the policies of the government. And they would hide icons and iconophiles and do all, try and preserve the ancient tradition. Then this council happened, and it was, it was seen as a kind of a, having the iconoclast doctrine crammed down their throats. And by the time of it was being applied, it created more and more difficulties. Around the year 780, so 754 was the Council of Urea, which purported to be an ecumenical council, although it really was more of a local council. In the year 780, the Empress Irene took the throne, and she repealed the iconoclast laws. She repealed the persecution of the iconophiles, and called an ecumenical council, which was the Council of 787, the Seventh Ecumenical Council. And at that council, which was truly ecumenical, they gathered bishops from all over the empire, and it was and iconoclasm was condemned. During this time, from 723, when iconoclasm began, up to 787, the papacy in Rome was the strongest in its resistance to the Byzantine iconoclasts and to the emperor. And what was happening was that there was already a growing estrangement within the West from the East. Of course, in the East, the Greeks looked down on the Westerners as a bunch of filthy barbarians, which they probably were. Barbarian is anybody who doesn't speak Greek, and so it was the Greeks were unable, actually the Romans of Constantinople were unable to hold on to power in the West. And so the conquests of Justinian in the 6th century were quickly eroding. Also in the middle of the 7th century into the 8th century, one of the major holdings of the Byzantine Empire in the West, the area surrounding Ravenna, fell, and went under was under Western control. So there was less and less control coming from Constantinople, and there were also not a whole lot of troops coming from Constantinople. On the other hand, Constantinople was preoccupied as to trying to figure out how to keep the Muslims at bay on the south, how to keep the Russians at bay to the northeast, and how to keep the Bulgarians at bay to the northwest. So by this time, Constantinople, what was left of the Roman Empire, was pretty much under siege. It was still a great imperial city, but it was under siege. In the West, what was going on was the rise of the Carolingian dynasty, and I'll get into that because that history also impacts a little bit later on what was going on. But in the meantime, while the papacy, which at that time was Greeks and Italians, but mostly Greeks up until the year until the late 8th century, were in total opposition to the iconoclasts in Constantinople. So you had the papacy in opposition to the empire, both the patriarch as well as the emperor, and this did not bode well for relations between the East and the West, and one could not look to the other for support. And we'll get to Charlemagne a little bit later in this. So in 787, Irene, Empress Irene, who was the sole monarch at the time, called the council. Iconoclasm was defeated. But by the year 800, iconoclasm returned. And there was a new dynasty of emperors that favored iconoclasm, and it was finally not defeated until 840. So almost all the churches that we see left in what was the Byzantine Empire. The iconography is from after 840. There's very little that survived iconoclasm. The only places where the iconography did survive were places like Sinai, Jerusalem, all of these places that were in the Islamic Caliphate, where the Muslims had not swept in and destroyed the churches. And so, for example, still in Sinai, you have all of these ancient icons from the 5th and the 6th century. You have manuscripts from the 5th and the 6th century. And there are places all over the Middle East where you have these ancient churches, which have bits and pieces of frescoes and iconography going back to the time of Justinian or before. So there was a certain little bit of a bright side to the Islamic conquest. Not too bright, but it was. So is this clear so far? Mm-hmm. All right. One of the there's a number of important things regarding the relationship between New Rome, Constantinople, and the Carolingians. So in the late 8th century, Charles, who was essentially he was the king of the Lombards, and then he was king of the Franks, and then he was essentially king over the whole of Francia, or Francia probably. Which was a vassal state of Byzantium. He looked at Byzantium and saw that there was a woman on the throne, the Empress Irene. So far as he was concerned, that meant that the throne was empty, because he would not, being a Frank, he wouldn't recognize a woman as the sovereign. So in the year 800, and this and well, and in the previous century, the Carolingian dynasty, you know, people like Charles Martel and his sons, and you know, finally Charles the Great, Charlemagne, you know, had been involved in all sorts of battles, primarily to drive the Muslims out first of France, and then they were trying to drive them out of Spain, and with varying amounts of success. Now it's really, you know, there's a whole lot of politically correct nonsense that you know that where, you know, people say, oh, it was such a peaceful coexistence between the Muslims and the Christians and the Jews. Well, yeah, it's peaceful if you have a sword on your neck, you know, threatening to chop your head off. That you're going to be peaceful if you have a sword threatening to chop your head off. A time of great creativity, of course. You know, some of the greatest intellects of the Roman Empire, which had fled Constantinople and taken refuge in Spain, in the Gothic kingdom, then got overrun. Well, they were enslaved, and it's actually from them and through them that a lot of the you know, the philosophy and the wisdom, Aristotle, mathematics, all of this stuff was transmitted to the Arabs. In Byzantium, you know, any kid who came from a wealthy family who was being educated would read Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and Pythagoras and, you know, all of the classics. And it would go through a Christian lens. Say, yes, they said all of these things, but they were pagans and we don't believe, you know, this, and this, and so you can disregard that. But these are the things that you can, as a Christian, take from this philosophy. So Aristotle was nothing new to the Byzantines. You know, every schoolboy would read Aristotle. But when in Spain, where you had the books, and you had the philosophers, the teachers, the Greeks who had been enslaved to teach this material. They gave it without editorial comment. And so, as things developed in Spain, a lot of the Greek classics were taken uncritically, and it was because of that, the uncritical adoption and adaptation of classical Greek philosophy, that scholasticism began to develop in the West. It's credited with the Arabs, but who taught the Arabs? The Arabs were not exactly scholars. Most of them were just warriors. And the other group that was present in that mix was the Jews, because a lot of the Jews who had been exiled from by the Romans, you know, in 70 A.D. What is this? Sephardic Jews, right?
They were the ones that went to Spain and Greece.
Versus the Ashkenazi, who are the Khazars, basically. So the Sephardic are the real Jews, the children of Israel.
Yeah, they moved out, like they were in Italy, they were all over the Roman Empire.
Right.
And some converted to Christianity. And,
right. But they
were in all the Arab countries. They were in all of the surrounding countries.
Right.
Or not countries.
But many of them,
Syria and Egypt.
But many had taken refuge in Spain.
And then some, and
they collaborated with the Arabs. And so that didn't make, that was one of the things that soured the relationship in Spain towards the Jews. And so on one hand, you've got, people who, you've got modern scholars who want to paint a nice, pretty picture of how peaceful the Arabs were, and with this multicultural civilization and mix. But don't take that uncritically. The goal of the Arabs of Islam was to take all of Europe. So they pushed into Spain, they pushed across the Pyrenees, and halfway into what's now France. They took Sicily, they took southern Italy, and were pushing up the Italian peninsula. They took, of course, all of North Africa, and were pushing in on Asia Minor. And of course, eventually, in a kind of pincher movement, they also took not just Asia Minor, but all the Balkans. So most of Southern Europe was under Muslim attack or domination at some point. So the Byzantine Empire, the Byzantines were under siege. Of course, they were more preoccupied with what was going on in their part of the world, and they basically abandoned the West. Because they didn't feel like they had trustworthy vassals in the West. Who are these Franks? And so in the year 800, the Pope essentially, the Pope crowned on Christmas Day, the Pope crowned Charles as Emperor of the Romans. Supposedly this was a surprise. I doubt it. The scholars doubt it. How could, as one of them wrote, how could Charles not have known what was coming when he could see a large jeweled crown sitting on the altar as he walked into the church? It was a
in keeping with the ancient Roman tradition of pretending not to want to be emperor right before you were acclaimed.
Right, exactly. Exactly. So so he paid attention to tradition. Now, so far as the Byzantines go, they just thought, just one more pretender. They didn't take him seriously. He was an unwashed barbarian who was illiterate, and well, how do you take such people seriously, right? They, on the other, in France or in Greece, or well, what am I saying? In Francia, in the so-called Holy Roman Empire, they did take him seriously. And although Charles seldom would claim the imperial title of Emperor of the Romans, he essentially did. He essentially acted like it. And partly because, and he considered himself as the legitimate emperor who was the heir, or who was the next in line to Constantine from Constantine VI, because Irene was not legitimate, which is interesting. Now, Irene, on the other hand, was a great advocate of the icons, and she oversaw the Council of 787, which declared the Council of 754 to be a false council, and had the veneration of the icons not only restored but made into law, because the declarations of ecumenical councils had the effect of law in the Roman Empire. what was interesting, one of the things that's quite interesting, is that there was a problem with the with conveying the message and the minutes of the council, since nobody from the West, and especially from the Franks, was present at the council. Of course, at the council, everything had gone on in Greek. And as would be the normal procedure in any meeting, they first read the minutes of the previous council, which was 754, the Iconoclast Council of Ierea, into the minutes of 787. Right? Old business, new business. Things haven't changed, you know, and how meetings are run. Well, I don't know whether it was because the translators in the court, in the Carolingian court, didn't speak very good Greek, and they just got tired of trying to translate all that Greek, and so they stopped after the minutes of the Council of Ierea of 754, and the minutes and the dogmatic declaration and the validation of iconography, of veneration of icons, and so forth, did not get transmitted to the West yet. And for a long time, it remained in Greek, which nobody read. And so there was a big problem. Because on one hand, in the West, they were never iconoclasts. In fact, they resisted against the iconoclasts. Whereas in the East, after the council, right, there was this new iconoclasm. Well, Charlemagne wasn't exactly on good terms with the new Byzantine emperor, because he was viewed as being a pretender to the throne. So it's not like there was going to be a whole lot of, shall we say, brotherly correction and of bringing the West into line with the East. So, it's my theory, personally, this was my MDiv thesis, actually, that the whole idea of the adoration of the sacrament comes out of this. Because it was never practiced in the East. It was always very clear that there was a distinction, and the Seventh Ecumenical Council makes a very strong distinction between veneration and adoration, between proskynesis and latria.
Which one is worship?
The problem with the word worship is that it's it can mean either one. It's whereas veneration is not worship. It's to pay respect to. And the Greek word proskynesis means to bow down before. Latria means adoration. It means and it's understood in the tradition that adoration is only given to God. It's never given to anything relative. And so, and this distinction is central to the conciliar decision. We venerate the icons, we don't worship them. We worship Christ, who is depicted in the icons, but the icon itself is a symbol. Listen, one of the greatest writers of the time, was St. John of Damascus. And I'd like to read a couple of long quotes. Now, St. John of Damascus died in the year 749. His father had been a part of the Sultan's court, and it had been he who negotiated the surrender of Jerusalem to the Islamic armies, so that the Church of the Holy Sepulchre remained a church, so that the Christian holy places remained Christian, and there was not mass slaughter when the Muslims took over Jerusalem. At some point, St. John also worked for the Sultan or the Caliph or whoever it was, and then left that and became a monk. But all of this was within the Islamic Caliphate. So the whole iconoclast controversy didn't touch them, because it was they were outside of the Byzantine Empire. So so St. John was free to write very strongly against the iconoclast position. So, and his theology then became foundational for the decrees of the council. So he says, concerning the charge of idolatry, icons are not idols but symbols. Therefore, when an Orthodox venerates an icon, he is not guilty of idolatry. He is not worshipping the symbol, but merely venerating it. Such veneration is not directed toward wood or paint or stone, but towards the person depicted. Therefore, relative honor is shown to material objects, but worship is due to God alone. This is the distinction between veneration and adoration. In other words, veneration is shown to material objects, but adoration is due to God alone, to retranslate it. We do not make obeisance to the nature of wood, but we revere and do obeisance to him who was crucified on the cross. When the two beams of the cross are joined together, I adore the figure because of Christ who was crucified on the cross. But if the beams are separated, I throw them away and burn them. He continues, venerating icons, having them in churches and homes, is what the church teaches. They are open books to remind us of God. Those who lack the time or learning to study theology need only to enter a church to see the mysteries of the Christian religion unfolded before them. Icons are necessary and essential because they protect the full and proper doctrine of the Incarnation. While God cannot be represented in his eternal nature, no man has seen God, John 1, he can be depicted simply because he became human and took flesh. Of him who took a material body, material images can be made. In so taking a material body, God proved that matter can be redeemed. He deified matter, making it spirit-bearing. And so if flesh can be a medium for the spirit, so can wood or paint, although in a different fashion. I do not worship matter, but the creator of matter, who for my sake became material and deigned to dwell in matter, who through matter effected my salvation. One of the things that's important in this is, in a sense, it's coming around the whole Nestorian Monophysite, Diophysite issue. It's coming around full circle with the emphasis on the humanity of Christ being depicted in the icons. Somebody's phone was buzzing. And so the we have this focus on the veneration of the image as a means of worshiping the one who is depicted on it. But there's no confusion between venerating the image and worshiping Christ. There's no confusion between venerating a saint and worshiping Christ. We don't worship the saints, we venerate them. We don't worship the icons, we venerate them. However, this brings up another really important idea, and that was this issue brought up by Constantine V, of the Eucharist being the only acceptable icon of Christ. Well, the Eucharist is not an icon. However, in the ancient fathers, before this whole controversy developed, there was no highly developed Eucharistic theology, and so you had the Eucharist and the sacraments in general being referred to as icons, symbols, types. Still in the liturgy of St. Basil, we say, again, we offer unto thee these antitypes of the body and blood of Christ. You know, the bread and the wine of the Eucharist. And the word symbol also is used in the ancient fathers to describe the word, or just to describe the sacraments. Now, it's not a symbol in the sense that we understand symbols in our contemporary culture. Our contemporary culture understands symbol in terms of the nominalist controversy of the 12th century, in which the symbol and that which it symbolizes were separated. In other words, there's no real link between the symbol and that which it symbolizes, other than it kind of reminds you mentally of one, reminds you of the other. That's also in the West when the use of typology fell apart. Typology, which is, I mean, you've all been in these classes. It's central to the scriptural understanding, right? And you can't understand the New Testament or the Old Testament without understanding typology. It's this foundational scriptural method of reasoning and presentation. Well, in the ancient concept of symbol or symbolon, what the word means is to throw together. In other words, it throws two realities together. And so that by partaking of one, you partake of the other. So that the material reality makes present the transcendent reality. And the transcendent reality is made present and participable by the material reality. So for example, you know, the concept of transubstantiation used for the Eucharist wouldn't be invented for another 600 years or 500 years. But the concept of in this approach of symbol, type, image, icon, you have the reality of Christ, of his body, of his presence, manifested by the bread of the Eucharist and the wine of the Eucharist. And so that it truly is the body of Christ, while truly being bread and wine. And there's no contradiction. It's both. It's an image, obviously, right? Which is the word icon. It's a symbol. It holds it together. It holds the mystery together. It's a type. It's a type of Christ's body being crucified, you know, on the cross. It's a type of and broken. It's a type of Christ's body deified in the kingdom of God. It's a type of Christ's body which he offers in the form of bread at the Last Supper. It's a type, you follow that, right? So there was never a question in the early church about the reality of the sacraments. You know, just read the prayers before communion, which are from the early fathers. There's no question that it's truly the body and blood of Christ. You know, and what do we confess every time we receive? I believe, O Lord, and I confess that Thou art truly the Christ, the Son of the living God, who came into the world to save sinners, of whom I am chief, and that this is truly Thine own most pure body, and this is truly Thine own precious blood. It wasn't until the 13th century that that sacramental reality of the symbol began to break down in the West. It never broke down in the East. This is one of those areas in which some of the questions that were asked in the West are non-questions in Eastern theology.
What was the name of the controversy?
Well, it was the nominalist controversy. Abelard and so forth. Maybe you can explain nominalism better than I. Somebody. Quick quiz. Well, essentially, nominalism means that an object is nothing other than what it can be observed to be. It may, and a symbol. There's no connection.
It says here the doctrine that universals or general ideas are mere names without any corresponding reality, and that only particular objects exist. Properties, numbers, and sets are thought of as merely features of the way of considering the things that exist. Mm-hmm. Important in medieval scholastic thought. Nominalism is associated particularly with William of Ockham.
Yeah.
Here's a question. So in the West, they went too far sometimes and almost worshipped the Eucharist. Do you think that?
No, they do worship the Eucharist.
Oh, they do. Okay. Do you think that might have led to a reaction in the other direction on their side? And that's why I kind of lost some of the. That's why the nominalist opinion would have evolved.
I don't know. That's a good question. I don't know that history well enough at all. I don't know whether it was a reaction or if.
Evolutionary reaction. Or...
Yeah. Do you know?
What was the question, sir?
Oh, when you had the West that worships the Eucharist, and then you also have the West that has a nominalist opinion of the Eucharist. And how did the first position lead to the second, or did it?
I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's not like it was. It's not like there were two parties. That basically it came up. This philosopher, William of Ockham, and I know Abelard was involved, Peter Abelard, right? Is that anyway? They came up with this philosophy, and it essentially it spread from their teaching. It would be worth reading about. But what it did was it radically transformed Western thought. It radically transformed the presuppositions underlying Western thought. And so basically, up until the 11th century, the East and the West pretty much shared the same presuppositions. Granted, the West was dealing with Latin translations, and the East was working in Greek primarily, but the West had its own local peculiarities, and then there was the Augustinian wild cards that were thrown into the mix. But Augustine would have been shocked by nominalism. But yeah.
Why did nominalism, which you say is a thing is what it appears to be, kind of,
Yeah.
why did that contribute to the worship, the adoration of the Eucharist?
Well, I don't think it did. What it did was it ultimately led in Protestantism to the disregarding of the Eucharist as simply an external symbol with no reality, and so
Okay.
so that
That had nothing to do with the adoration.
right.
Okay.
So with the Protestants, they would definitely say this is not the body of Christ. This is bread. This is, but what broke down ultimately as a result is the entire sacramental system. The entire understanding of what the Holy Mysteries are, which is essential, I would say, essential to the apostolic tradition, and that's a pretty serious thing. It represented a radical break with the apostolic tradition. And it fit in well with the whole adaptation of Aristotelian philosophy in the West, by the West, which they got through the Arabs in Spain, and then which got transmitted into the West, and people took it and ran with it, and they totally restructured theology. Now, one of the things that's also important at this point was monasticism in the West was equally, or if not more important than it was in Byzantium at this time. If 10% of the people of Constantinople were monastics, I have no idea what percentage it was in the West, but almost all the people that could read, with a few exceptions, were living in monasteries. It was, basically there was social, cultural, and political chaos, and there were all these little princedoms and things, and the Carolingians tried to unite it. It didn't last very long. Some semblances of it did, but basically a few memories more than anything else. But the West didn't get its act together for another several hundred years, in reality. In the meantime, the East was going through, and one of the things that did get the West to get its act together was the calling of the Crusades. Because the papacy took having on his own crowned a new Roman emperor relatively out of the blue. The papacy began to gather more and more authority over not only the culture, but over the political system of the West, to try and unite it under itself. So in a sense, in the West, what happened, whereas in Byzantium you still had the symphony between the church and the state, in the West, the papacy took over the state, and in fact it became a civil power, and the act of gathering an army for the Crusades. Now we're jumping into the 11th century, but the act of gathering an army composed of soldiers from all these various kingdoms, and compelling soldiers from all these various kingdoms to come and to fight under the papal banner, actually elevated the papacy to almost to imperial status. And so, as an heir of the Roman Empire, you have these two radically different models developing. Constantinople in the east, which was on its last legs, and the papacy in the west, which was really just getting going at the time of Charlemagne. Monasticism in the West was very important. It was primarily initially on a Benedictine model. Benedict took his model from the East, from the works of St. John Cassian, from the rule of St. Basil the Great, and others, and wrote his rule, which was a little more Western in its kind of ethos, but ultimately just one other Orthodox rule, monastic rule. And so most of the monasteries followed that rule in the first millennium. But also around this time, there began to arise reforms of the Benedictine rule. And so you had various attempts to return to a more primitive Benedictine usage on one hand, and you had the growth of these massive royally sponsored abbeys with huge buildings and huge numbers of people and huge amounts of power, controlling massive areas of land and thousands of serfs, which was all part of this equation in the West, whereas in the East, monasticism remained central within the life of the church, and eventually started to take over the leadership of the church. And part of that was as a coming out of a sense of needing to protect the church, and by people who didn't have to worry about families, who didn't have to worry about their own wealth, but they would be free to offer themselves as martyrs to the invading hordes of Muslims. so that's another dynamic that kind of characterizes this whole period between, say, 850 up until about 1400, 1450. And with 1450 in the East, you have the complete takeover of the leadership of the church by the monks in the Roman in Constantinople and in what would become the Ottoman Empire.
By what year?
By 1453, with the fall of Constantinople.
Did they control all the parishes? Or no?
Well, a lot of the parishes were closed, you know, and the people were subjected. But yeah, it was again, you know, the church went into a defensive mode in the East, and to try and preserve what was left against the hostile Muslim secular rulers. Whereas in the West, things began to open up, and part of that is because starting with the Fourth Crusade in 1204, you had massive numbers of people leave Constantinople and go to the West. Father John Meyendorff characterizes this as a conflict which began really at the end of around the same time as well in the 9th century as the humanist Byzantine humanist versus the monastic kind of, you could call it a controversy. You have the humanists who basically were pushing I can't really say secular, but they were pushing a well, secular, philosophical, kind of classical philosophy, classical approach to culture, as opposed to the monks who were pushing for a more radically Christian understanding of society and structuring of society. I don't know, does this make any sense? Okay. A lot of these are really broad strokes, obviously, but how do you cover hundreds of years of history?
But who were the people like that were, well, we know what the monastics were promoting, but then who were the people promoting a more secular approach to Christianity?
Well, there were
practice.
Well, it wasn't a secular approach. It was
a more.
It was. I don't know how you would. It's hard to understand in our because secular in our context means something entirely different. I mean, it's not like these people were not Orthodox Christians. They were all Orthodox Christians. They would all go to the same liturgy. You know.
Did they also accommodate modernity, not by, so is it more mode of life? And
yeah, I think it was
the application is so you can go to the theater and see plays on Broadway.
It was much more kind of a worldly life.
A worldly life.
You know, what would that be in Byzantium? It would be going to the horse races, going to the theater, you know, getting a philosophical education in classical philosophy.
So it doesn't mean they didn't believe,
right?
They could have been good people.
Oh yeah, they could have been good people. But as opposed to a monastic orientation towards life, which was much more enclosed, focused on the services, focused on the gospel, not much, not putting much value in literature and art and all of these, or as much value in non-religious literature and art, but focusing on religious art and literature, you know, and spending their time, you know, doing their work and going to church, which is what monks do, basically. And there was some of the, for example, one of the great Byzantine humanists was Photius, Patriarch Photius, who had this massive library, and thousands and thousands and thousands of volumes, which at that time was pretty unusual. You can only imagine how much something like that would have been worth, you know, because every one of those was a manuscript. And you know, so all the philosophy, all the you know, literature, and you know, this was something that he, you know, very much valued and saw as kind of great fruit of that civilization. And it's not like we wouldn't think otherwise either. You know, we would see that as you know, something great. But the monastics were not so. What it was, in it also, what it would also come down to is the monastics were had an attitude of orthodoxy or death. You know, we will endure whatever we need to endure, but we're going to take our stand, and we're going to take our stand for the integrity of the Orthodox faith. And if they want to kill us, they can kill us.
So
and they did.
10% of the population were monastic.
Mm-hmm.
So what about having more children and more population?
Well, I don't think there was a problem with that.
There was no.
Okay. No. Days before birth control, and of course abortion has always been prohibited by the church from the very beginning.
Yeah, but you don't have enough men for the amount of women that you had.
Well, there were women monastics too.
Oh,
Yeah.
it could be.
So anyway, what other questions?
So when did I know this is getting well ahead in history, but when did Greek parish life restart then? Only after independence, or?
Well, there always were parishes. Some of them became many of the Muslims closed many of the churches. Remember, in many places, the people were forced to convert to Islam. Those that you had a choice. You either convert, you die, or you pay. Most people couldn't pay, and they didn't want to die, so they chose to convert. What's that?
You go under the ground, like
and there are those, and there are still underground Christians in parts of Turkey, which is interesting, who are good Muslim citizens publicly and have churches in their basements. And it depends on where. The persecution was spotty. Now, in a lot of the empire, you know, there would be a wave of persecution, then the church would revive. More waves of persecution, the church would survive. Many of the monasteries were shut down, but some of them survived. On Mount Athos, they couldn't shut it down, but they taxed them to death. So many of the monasteries came out of the Islamic period with vast tax debt to the Sultan, or Caliph, or whatever it was called. So things didn't normalize until after independence. But one of the things that happened is that the monasteries became the major places of people who were educated. In other words, who could read. In the villages, they would get some guy who had a really good memory and had either memorized the service or could read enough that he could get through the liturgy. But that was about it. It's not like he could sit down and read and comprehend the liturgy either. But they would ordain him because he was pious. So, and that you can't really say that that's normal parish life.
Yeah, I had read, I think from Callisto's way, that they kept doing that sort of society into the 20s of whoever the most popular guy was, and he's priest now.
Mm-hmm. Well, they would give him some training and, you know, have him serve the liturgy for 40 days in the bishop's house, you know, and or the bishop's monastery, and hopefully he could read enough that he could get through the prayers and send him out, and that was it. You know, education isn't everything, but it helps. So, what else?
Can you say something more about the women monastics?
Mhm.
I'm kind of interested.
Well,
What was their life like as compared to the men, or was it the same?
it's identical.
Oh, it's identical.
Women's monasticism and men's in Orthodoxy, men's and women's monasticism are absolutely identical, except for the underwear.
Yeah, right.
You know, otherwise even the robes are identical. Yeah, and it's a kind of the only difference, of course, is that they would have a male priest come in and serve the services, and he wouldn't necessarily hear confessions, but he would give absolution. But the abbess of the convent would hear the confessions of the nuns, and they still do. And that's why you have abbesses are called Eurundissa, elders, and they're spiritual mothers, and it's pretty incredible to see when it's in action.
So there must have been a priest who was pretty much connected to that place.
Right.
Because they have services almost daily or...
Well, the thing is, the services were actually designed to be done by lay people. The daily cycle of services, you know, matins, vespers, and the hours, and, you know, compline and stuff. You don't need a priest. And
Just for the Eucharist?
Just for the Eucharist,
Okay.
and for confessions.
Okay.
And so monasticism actually started as a lay movement without priests. And then initially people would go to the village parish where there was a priest and simply go there on Sundays, and that was it. And on Mount Athos and in other places where they would have skeets. A skeet, you know, we think of a skeet today as a small monastic house, but a skeet can also be a cluster of small monastic houses with 2, 3, 4, 5, 10 people in each one, with a common church. And so they'll go to the common church for the liturgy on Sunday in the middle of the complex, and each house would have its own cycle of services. Yeah. Now, and very often, at least in some places, usually women monastics outnumber male monastics 4 to 1.
No kidding.
Yeah.
Today?
They work more, no?
Yeah, especially in the Russian.
Yeah, they do.
I'm talking about more about Greek, but it's this. It's I mean they all work tirelessly, endlessly. Yeah, and there's a huge concentration on hospitality, but there's also usually farm work and heavy manual labor, and
Yeah.
so and you know, male monasteries too. I mean, there's really not a substantial difference. You know, women treat each other differently than men treat each other. Men are much more easygoing, and women are not. So, but it's always been very, as you know, as it is today. It's always been very unusual to have a celibate priest or a monastic priest in a parish. So all parish clergy have almost universally been married since, you know,
So
the
they're
apostolic
really
age.
two tracks.
There are two
The
tracks.
monastic track or the priest.
Right.
uh,
Well, the monastic tract or the married tract.
And possibly priesthood.
Yeah. Yeah, or for a priest. You can either be a monk. You have to have it resolved before you're ordained. You have to either be a monk or be married.
It's a good idea to figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah, and you can't change it. You know.
There is celibacy.
There is the practice where you have people who are simply celibates,
No married priest.
but it's a bad idea. It's a very bad idea.
No.
You mean moving outside of monastic
Right.
communities?
No, not even being there. I
Right.
mean,
Yeah,
you're
just
ordained priest as a human being.
Well, being a bachelor,
Yeah, but
being a bachelor priest,
that's not.
not good,
Oh, gosh.
not good. So, what else?
And do the women who are monastics, they call nuns,
Mm-hmm.
and are they, do they have certain roles in the local church?
No.
No, they're not.
Well, usually not. I mean,
It's
there's
not the same.
there are nuns who live in monasteries, and there are nuns who are attached to parishes. And usually, very often in Greece or in Russia, there'll be a nun behind the altar, and she runs the altar.
Oh.
And she tells those priests where to go and how to get there.
So they are involved, that's right. That was
Are
my
they
question.
involved? Yeah, absolutely.
When I was in
That's the only
Estonia, there
place
was
where
this
they were
one
hiding.
lady who thought that she was allowed to do whatever she wanted behind the altar, provided she was holding on to a man while she was back there.
Most of them don't have that idea. You don't. No, they're just back there, and they run the altar, and they make sure
Keep
that
things organized.
they keep things organized, and they keep the boys organized, and
It's a good idea.
throw them out when they need to. And, so, and in the women's monasteries too. And an abbess is a formidable character. You know, there's all sorts of stories that came out of Russia that about these abbesses who stood up to the communists. In fact, there's one story about an abbess, and the local commissar or whatever wanted to run a road, and the road was supposed to go right through the middle of the monastery. Well, the abbess wasn't about to stand for that, so she got out there in her full gear with her sisterhood, and she basically argued him down, and so the road went around. So it's abbesses. You want to see the potential for women's ministry in the Orthodox Church. You look in the monasteries. It's always been that women minister primarily to women, and I mean there are nuns, abbesses, spiritual mothers who will have men as their spiritual children, but it's unusual. And of course there are women who are spiritual children of priests and monks, but most often women go go to the spiritual mothers. And that's just not developed yet here in this country. It's beginning. So, women's
Women are too rebellious.
right now that's exactly the case.
I'm speaking for myself.
Well, there's a very serious issue right now in women's monasteries because of the whole feminist thing, and women don't want to submit to anyone, and it used to be something rather different, because in a normal Orthodox world, children would grow up in obedience to their parents, and in strict obedience to their parents. And so it was an easy transition for them to go from their father's house into a monastery, or rather from their mother's house into the monastery. And they understood what obedience was then, and respect and love, and that they're not being disrespected by being in obedience, and they're not putting themselves down, and they're not, but rather that relationship is there to develop them to their greatest potential, and which is what monasticism is about, to a great extent. And so you've got a whole bunch of women's monasteries that are not getting young women, and they come and they want to watch TV, they want to play on their computer, they want to do their own thing, they don't want to do what they're told to do, they don't want to be in obedience, they don't want to do anything, they want to sit and that doesn't work. And it's a disaster. Now, it's interesting in our culture that with men, we don't have that problem. Maybe it's because men tend to be more hierarchical than women, and they just kind of naturally fall into place, and they find their place, and part of it's seniority, and part of it's, there's this whole, it's a different pecking order between men and women. And for men, it's very easy to just step into a position and find your place, and you're there, and it doesn't challenge anybody. You're not challenged by it. You can just do what you need to do. And so men thrive. Men thrive in that. But modern women, it's really, really hard. The only women's monasteries that are in this country that are doing well are the Elder Ephraim's Greek monasteries. And part of that is because some of the women who are coming there are coming from these very traditional, strict Greek homes where they have been in obedience to their parents, and they're in obedience to their parents until they're 35 or they're married. And that's tough. Or women who've been through it in life and are ready to submit and see the value of it and realize that they don't know everything. So.
Okay, so your advice, don't go to a monastery.
No, go see. I can tell you a bunch of really great women's monasteries, but it's going to be totally opposite of what our cultural values have become of this country. So that's a long answer to a.
Very interesting. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Don't go to a women prison either.
I was the confessor for a women's monastery for a number of years.
So you know.
So I know, and I've still got half a dozen nuns kind of attached. So, and most of them are elderly, or older, and would love to have young women around. you know, and to share monastic life and their wisdom, and you know, not to boss them around and all of that kind of stuff, but to, so. But if you have a chance to go to, well, there's what, Saxonburg and near Philadelphia. There's Hazelton. There's a monastery, a Greek monastery in Hazelton, which is very solid.
Where's that?
Up near Wilkes-Barre. There are several around, you know, and you go there and you'll just be enfolded in love, and it's really amazing. But you'll see how traditional Greek monasticism, traditional Orthodox monasticism works, and there's no big difference between Russian and Greek. I mean, it's the language. The Russians eat more cabbage. The Greeks eat more olive oil. And that's the big difference, you know. So. Anyway. So, is there anything else? Okay. For next week. So do you like this kind of broad overview
Yes.
of the history? Okay. I also prepared to talk about St. John of Damascus and St. Theodore the Studite, who were two of the most important figures in the iconoclast controversy, who brought about the victory of Orthodoxy. I think the next class can deal with them, and then begin to talk about the mission of the Slavs. Kirill Methodius and the conversion of the Bulgarians, the conversion of Vladimir, which is all 9th, 10th century. So, you know, there were also the monastic reforms in the West, and some of that's pretty interesting. But it may be more interesting to do that together with the development of the mendicants, the Franciscans and the Dominicans, and because that all plays a big role. And the Dominicans in particular played a big role, not only in Constantinople but also in Russia. Not to mention the Inquisition. So, okay. Let's pray. It is truly meet to bless thee, O Theotokos, ever blessed and most pure, and the Mother of our God, more honorable than the cherubim, more glorious beyond compare than the seraphim, who without corruption gave us birth to God the Word. True Theotokos, we magnify thee. The blessing of the Lord be upon you through his grace and love for mankind, always now and ever, and to ages of ages.
Amen.
Amen.